And former President Trump is set to address the Republican National Convention tonight in his first speech since the assassination attempt. A Trump campaign official says it's not just a moment for him and the party, it's a moment for the country. And this speech marks a rare moment and a pivot point in the race, even as it's unclear exactly how the assassination attempt could change the dynamics of the race. I want to bring in ABC's Brad Mielke, host of the Start Here podcast, for more. Brad, the news cycle runs so quickly now, but we are still in shock and sort of processing the fact that this assassination attempt happened just a few days ago. So it almost feels weird to ask you this, but we're in the middle of convention, so I have to. How might that event impact the election?
Yeah, and you can feel the emotional reaction from anyone you talk to, especially at the convention, but even around the country, right? And so we started looking into whether this actually would have an impact on the election. We've seen attempted assassinations in the past. So I talked to Professor Alan Lickman. He's a professor of history at American University. And he said you actually do not see a real direct correlation between assassination attempts and those candidates going on to win their races necessarily. So, like, you take the 1981 assassination attempt on Ronald Reagan, right? A lot of people look at his landslide victory in 1984 and go, oh, like, this must be why America's rallying behind Reagan. Actually, if you look at his poll numbers, even after the assassination, they were in the gutter for quite a while. It was really when the economy improved, that's when his poll numbers rose. So it didn't necessarily have to do with the assassination. Look at 1975, Gerald Ford is almost assassinated. He loses his next election. And in 1912, Teddy Roosevelt is running. He gets shot during the campaign. And I think this is the most interesting example because of the Trump example here. Teddy Roosevelt was a former president trying to get back into office. He gets shot during a campaign event, gets shot in the chest. And the only reason that the bullet doesn't kill him is because it gets lodged. A lot of people thought this was an act of God. It gets lodged. It has to pass through a 50-page speech that he's keeping in his breast pocket. He looks down, realizes he's not dead. Instead of going to the hospital, he addresses the crowd and says, I don't know if you've understood this, but I've just been shot. That will not stop a bull moose. He was running on the bull moose ticket.
Yep.
This was his, like, clenched fist moment. Like, talk about a moment, right? And yet he lost his next election. So there's not this direct correlation that you might expect.
That said, there's a different picture at the RNC now than we saw going in, particularly Nikki Haley, one of Donald Trump's fiercest critics and most recent critics, now giving her his full endorsement. How is this impacting the party itself, galvanizing around him? More moderate people from the party now galvanizing around Trump, and could that indirectly have an impact?
Yeah, that's the thing, because it does galvanize the people around the candidates. And so the question is, like, if it galvanizes people in your party, they don't get to vote twice, right? So if it's galvanizing people who were already excited to vote for the candidate and now they believe that the candidate is even more sort of touched by an angel, that doesn't necessarily make the difference. What does make a difference is if it really affects people, if it paints the candidate in a different light for people who were undecided or who maybe were going to stay on the couch on election day or who even going to vote for President Biden. Those are kind of the question mark, folks, and yet you do not see generally in these historical contexts a lot of people switching their votes all of a sudden. So that'll be the big question.
And Brad, what about the impact in the context of the pressure on President Biden to step out of the race, the juxtaposition of the fist in the air, the standing right back up, and
right,
so on, what everyone's seeing from these images of Trump on that day, while President Biden is getting all this pressure to step out of the race because of how slowly he moves sometimes and because of concerns about his age and his mental fitness. Could that have a disproportionate impact in this case because of that surrounding environment?
Well, it's interesting. We actually looked as well at candidates who leave the race for whatever reason, right? And whether, you know, that could actually have an effect down the line in sort of what it does to the party, what it does to the entire political picture. What's interesting about that is the timing, because going back decades, you've had candidates who've bowed out of races going into the convention or even during the convention. That's what conventions are for, right? What gets really tricky is if a candidate has to step away after the convention. We only have one instance of that in modern history. It was 1972. Vice presidential candidate had to get out when there was this big scandal about him getting mental health treatment. In that case, the party still decides. So the DNC has it in their charter that they can still pick a new candidate if the current one has stepped away from the race after the convention, but you got to do it before generally ballots are printed. Otherwise, it's pretty legally spicy.
Interesting. All right, Brad Mielke, thank you.
Thanks.